Hello. If you're expecting Christopher Boudas, a bit of a surprise, Christopher isn't available today. So I'm Jim Goldsmith. I'm the awards officer and chair of the publications committee. So I'm going to be hosting tonight's Teatime talk. We're very lucky to have Christopher Jarvis with us tonight. He's an associate professor at the London School of Hygiene and Topical Medicine. And he's going to be talking about the work he does as a volunteer with MapAction. And he's been doing that since 2016. So without further ado, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to talk. So I really enjoy this because I get the absolute privilege of telling you about something that I've been incredibly fortunate to be involved with for the last 6 years, which is the charity MapAction. And really, when it comes to it, we do two things as a charity. One is we respond to emergencies, and the second is we do preparedness to get people that are already in countries where emergencies happen to a point that they're able to respond to them by themselves, or at least have greater capacity to do that. And the way I like to think about MapAction is really it's a mechanism through which technical people like yourselves are able to get to different emergencies. So a bit about myself. So I'm a volunteer at MapAction, but I'm also on the board. So I'm a director now, and I sit there and get involved with some of the strategy stuff. I also work as an assistant professor of disease outbreaks and humanitarian emergencies at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And then I'm working as a senior scientist at UKHSA, which is the public health agency for the UK. And I was a member of something called SPI-M during COVID, which was the UK government sort of modelling advisory group. For those of you, you may have heard of SAGE. So SPI-M is one of the groups that fed into SAGE for scientific advice during COVID. So a few different things, but it's not too atypical, to find that MapAction volunteers end up doing a bunch of different stuff with their time. But onto MapAction. So what I want you to think of is the last time that you saw a big emergency on TV, and that feeling that you probably had of, I'd like to do something that's useful, or I want to help. And that may end up in you donating some money to a charity or something like that. Or you may try and band together with other people to think about what can I do. But one of the things that we know is we're individuals that have technical skills. We're able to analyze data, process stuff, present information. And fortunately, in 2002, some bright sparks thought, why don't we set up an organization that allows us to get people with these technical skills into the field to try and help decision makers make better decisions, to kind of just help them have more information available and hopefully improve the decisions that they make. You can't guarantee it, but you can at least try and increase the amount of information that they're basing it on and try and strengthen the resources that they have. So MapAction is about 100 individuals in total. It's quite a lean organization with about 75 of them being volunteers. And that's a real asset to us because we have 75 people who are diverse within, say, the geospatial community. And we'll have a range of different backgrounds in terms of maybe working in, say, weather or something like that, or myself, I work in health. And that means when we do have an emergency, we can pull on those different expertise to try and improve the situation for the MapAction member that's in the field trying to respond. We meet about once a month to do training, and that training can be incredibly fun. We end up sort of camping every time, and we'll sort of go through simulations of what we might do on an emergency and stuff like that, learn about humanitarian principles, but we also might do stuff like Excel training or data analysis, R, Python, a bit of mapping and stuff like that as well. And what you can see here is a team photo of our yearly exercise. So every year we simulate some sort of emergency and we put everybody through our paces and the processes so that they can see what is it like when we're in the field, what is it like to respond, what are the different things that might come up. And as you can see, there's lots of smiling faces there. I think this is probably at the end of the exercise after not so much sleep, but as they're just about to get tucked into some sort of barbecue and socializing and stuff like that. So what have we done? We've been around since 2002 and we've responded to probably over 124 responses. This is a slide that's impossible to keep up to date because every time anybody makes a copy, something happens and we end up responding to something else. So you can see there's natural hazards here. And if you think of all the really big emergencies like Nepal earthquake, Haiti earthquake, we were there. And you can see there's a long, long list. There's complex emergencies that include stuff like conflict, doing things in Afghanistan, more recently responding in Moldova and Poland to help with the Ukraine crisis, and then slow onset stuff. So there's been some economic things, explosions, food insecurity, and epidemics. So we did a lot of work on the pandemic in COVID, but we were also involved in the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone and sort of surrounding countries. And you can see it ends up being quite a diverse amount of stuff. So I want you to think again about when you're seeing an emergency on TV, what happens from a MapAction point of view is I get a text message and I get an email and it says, can you go? And then I log online to a Google spreadsheet and I go, yes, or I go checking. And then if I say yes, I probably get a phone call pretty shortly afterwards from the operations manager to go, great, we're booking flights. Like, how quickly can you get to the airport? And sometimes that can be as quickly as under 24 hours and we're off flying. So more recently, when I was going to Poland, it was about 3 hours from me getting the text message to getting in a taxi to go to an airport hotel. But we don't do this alone. So partnerships are something that we've always been involved with. So historically, we were strongly tied to the United Nations. There's a team called UNDAC, the United Nations Disaster Assessment Coordination, and they respond to emergencies to try and help coordinate what's going on. When you turn up to an emergency, there's lots of different actors. It's chaotic. There's lots of people wanting to help. And often people end up helping in very similar ways. And that can mean, say, lots of people receiving multiple blankets in one area and nobody receiving something in another area. So UNDAC are there to try and coordinate this stuff, and we provide the information management and the analysis side of what they do. And it's a really, really strongly established partnership that we've had over the last 20 years. On top of that, we do a lot of stuff to develop relationships with local partners. We've done some fantastic work in the Caribbean with SEDEMA, which is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. And we've had some really strong volunteers that have spent a lot of time over the last decade and longer developing connections there. Because essentially all of these humanitarian responses and preparedness and all the training come down to relationships. It's incredibly difficult and often just is not what happens in terms of turning up to a humanitarian response uninvited. A country typically has to raise an alert through a system to say, we want help. And when those notifications are raised, the UN come to us and say, MapAction, we want you there. Or we might have a government get in contact with us or an agency within a country to say, hey, we would really like support on this. And when that happens, we then get our volunteers, we go out there and we provide whatever support we can. So as an organization, really what we do comes down to these things. So we take data, we analyze it, we visualize it predominantly through maps, but it could be, it's getting more complicated now. It could be through dashboards, could be different graphs, could be writing a report or a presentation or all different things. And then we also do the training, and this feeds into those two aspects that I mentioned, the preparedness and anticipatory action and the emergency response. So part of the preparedness can be stuff like getting data ready for a bunch of different countries. So we've identified countries that we think are particularly vulnerable. So these are ones, say in the Caribbean, you know that there's probably going to be, there's a hurricane season each year. There might not be a bad hurricane, but it's a really good idea to have your different admin data sets for those countries already and there and available, or at the very least to find out they don't exist. So then you can try and get in contact and say, hey, it's really difficult to map your country. Can you tell us what information you have, or population data or things like that? And of course, all of this feeds in and strengthens everything when we're trying to do an emergency response. So now what I want to do is give you a bit of an idea of how we use data when we're in the field. And I like to think of it in terms of we find data, we might create data, and overall, we're trying to always improve the quality and the availability of the different amounts of data that we have. So humanitarian data is too much of it, and there's not enough. So when you turn up and it's chaotic and there's all these things going on, you may have people pull you over and say, hey, we need to go out and we need to survey this area. And, oh, we know this area is fine because it's a really rich area, so they won't have been as affected by the earthquake because their buildings are built better. And then you'll have people sending stuff to say, hey, I've got some coordinates for you. And I've received many, many messages over WhatsApp, and it ends up being a photograph of a handwritten bunch of numbers. And I'll ask stuff like, well, what are the coordinates of? And they'll say, I don't know. I go, okay, do you really want me to map this? Like, what is it I'm mapping? And those kind of things are really, really common. But at the same time, the data that you really, really want often doesn't exist. And that is, where are the people that are most affected? What do they need? And what have they currently received? And this data always has spatial and temporal dimensions. So the where are people, of course, inherently spatial. What do they need changes over time. Immediately, it could be search and rescue, but at a certain point, the search and rescue phase of emergency stops, and it becomes longer term things that we need to provide. Is it going to be cash so people can buy things or we can stimulate the economy? Is it going to be shelter because houses are ruined? Is it going to be food because people are now hungry? And this data comes from many, many different sources when you're there. It could be through conversations with people, could be from the internet, it could be negotiating with the government or different agencies that are there. And I will always turn up with a USB stick and I will get data in as many ways as I can, and we'll try to figure out what's useful, what needs to be analysed, and things like that very quickly. And it all needs to be analysed carefully and responsibly, because decisions will be made based on this. So if somebody tells you, oh, this region is where help is needed most, that could be because they're from that region. It could be because there's misinformation. And you need to try and establish, well, what is the quality and veracity of what you're doing as quickly as possible. So we come back to this find, create, improve. So finding existing data. So there's these things called CODs, common operational data sets. As you would expect, those are population, it's admin areas. And now there's a wonderful website, HDX, which is run by the UN, where it can give profiles of different countries. So here we've got Haiti, and it's telling us, look, there's 8 COD data sets, and the data grid completeness, which is a core data that they want to have, is only 9 out of 21. So this is a website that we would go to and try and download data if there was a response needed. And in MapAction, we do something called a data scramble. And that's very much like it sounds. It's a whole bunch of the volunteers jumping on the internet and looking for data far and wide. And we'll go to regular places that we're used to going, but when it's a specific country, we'll start looking for sort of more unique places that we might find. So an example of that is when we went to Beirut, somebody found a tourist map of Beirut that had admin 4 regions. They digitized it and they put it all together. And then when I turned up into Beirut, I said, are these actual regions? Do they exist? And I was reliably informed, no, they don't. I'm not sure where you found this, but it's not something that we use. But at the very least, we found something that could have been useful, and then we turned up and we verified it on the ground. And this is where speaking to people in the field becomes really, really useful for finding existing data as well. One of the other things is creating new data. So that example that I gave them was sort of digitizing something. It could be digitizing photos. So I've had it where people have come up and said, hey, I've taken photos of all these bridges, and I've taken them, and here are the ones that are not working anymore. And then I'll take that, I'll get the coordinates, I'll identify them, and then you might create something like a data set from that saying, here are the bridges that are currently down. And could also be from conversations. So that could be speaking to search and rescue, and they're telling me where are the areas that are the most damaged, and then you'll draw that up on a map and put it out. And we'll also try and publish stuff and be as visible as possible, because as soon as you publish things, it helps other people come up to you and say, oh, I think that's wrong, you should be changing that, or we know that's not correct. And then another way is conducting surveys. So this could be called needs assessments, where you're sending people out into the field and having conversations. It could also be people driving around on motorbikes to establish how the road networks work. We can be pretty imaginative when trying to collect data. And all of this new data is coming in. We're trying to generate insights and inform us on where else we might need to collect data as well. Then the main thing that I try to focus on is improving the existing data. Here, what we do is we kind of use people's egos against them. So we use their pride. Fundamentally, people want to be on the maps. Many, many times I have people come in and ask for a map, and they don't really know what they want, but they just want a map, so it's printed out, and they want it to be big so they can put it on the wall. But at the same time, everybody wants their logos on the map, and sometimes you get to the point where there's so many logos that the map is now much, much smaller. And one of the products that we produce is something called a 3W, which I'll talk about a bit more. And that one is really, really good for people coming up and saying, hey, I'm doing stuff and I'm not on this. And I'm able to then go, okay, here's how you fill in your information and can be on it next time. So it's fantastic for visibility, and it's really good for synthesis on going back and being like, right, this might be wrong, let's improve this kind of thing. So in terms of synthesis, what I'm looking for when I'm on a mission are gaps. And what I mean by gaps is I will take the baseline population, I'll try and get some idea of affected population. And this could range from a survey that's actually telling me how many houses are damaged, how many people have died, how many people are injured, sort of really detailed information like that. Or it could be rough and ready, volcano was here, draw 5, 10, 15 kilometers around it and go, right, I'm going to say the people closest to the volcano are the most affected. You might add in wind direction or stuff like that. Then I want to go, where have we done surveys? And just get an idea of where have people actually been. It's quite often people go where it's easier to go, or the areas that they know, rather than the areas that might need the most help. Then we'll look at the distribution of aid. So where have we delivered stuff? So here we have a map of aid distribution by sector. So NFIs are non-food products. So we can see in some of the regions we're getting what's called WASH help, which is water and sanitation. In some places it's shelter, so could be temporary housing, could be tools to fix their houses. And in other regions they're getting food or cash or stuff like this. And then what I'm going to do with these things is I am looking for, where is there a region that had a big baseline population, could have a large affected population, has not had a survey and hasn't received any aid? And if I spot a region like that, I'm going to the decision maker and I'm saying, hey, we should send some people there to see if these people are all right. And that would then allow us to move from a region which may have been missed to then receiving aid and actually getting help. And once you put this on a map, it becomes far, far easier to identify it. Before it's on a map, it's usually a bit like it is in this bottom right-hand side. It's just a bunch of names of places with some numbers next to it, or maybe some stuff, and you don't really get a good picture. Then we have the 3W map, which is another really interesting product we create called a who, what, where. So this is, who are you, what are you doing, where are you doing it? And this map will take over somebody's life during a mission, because trying to update it every single day, because there's so much going on, is incredibly, incredibly time consuming. And this is the map that causes the most annoyance, because people come up and say, we've been doing stuff for ages in this place and you haven't even got us on it. And that's great. The first one that you put out is absolutely awful, loads of gaps, and then it comes back and we get a much better version and people keep coming up and we show them how to fill it in. And it's really, really helpful for making sure that the limited resources that you have are being used in an efficient and effective way. So now I'm going to talk about a few of the missions that I've been on. So one of those is Mozambique. And in Mozambique, it was a cyclone and there was huge, huge amounts of flooding. We knew it was big and we knew it was bad, but we didn't know how big and how bad. So what we did in collaboration with Red Cross and the UN was we sent people up in helicopters with tablets and we recorded GPS coordinates. We said how big, how many people are in the area and how bad is it? And what we did was use that to then create this map. So in this map, the red means it's more critical. The size of the dot gives us an idea of the population. And this allowed us to go from the, we know it's big, we know it's bad, to we know which regions we think we have to get to soon. So anywhere where there was a big red circle was considered critical, or orange towards that. And it was like, right, those are the areas we're going to go to first by foot, by land, by driving. Yeah, so the helicopters gave us a quick, really big picture. And this was one of the experiences where I probably had what felt like the most impact, where I was the closest to being able to do like the entire process as data analysis. I went out in the helicopter, I collected data. We saw an area where we thought it was critical. There was a large population. It was very flooded. It looked bad. I came back, I downloaded the data, I processed it, I converted the coordinates into coordinates that the pilots use, which happens to be a different system from the one we have. I printed off a picture, and then I handed the picture to a pilot, handed the coordinates to them, and they flew off the helicopter and delivered aid. One of the other missions that I went on was to Haiti. And in Haiti, it was a bit of a different mission. This was because of an earthquake. And here we had a wonderful organization called Teatime, who had a group of young people who went straight out after the earthquake. They had been trained before, and they started interviewing people and collecting data. So they then had this data, and typically they would get a consultant, and it would take 3-4 months to get an analysis. But because we were in the field, we were able to analyze it within about 2 days. And suddenly one of the pictures that we got out was there was one region where they didn't have money to buy stuff, but there was food on the shelves. There was another region where they had money, but they didn't have food available. And this meant all of a sudden we could go, okay, we're going to provide cash to the people in the region where there's food, and we're going to provide cash to the markets in the region where there's no food, but there is money. So you have to be very, very careful in these situations. If we had gone in where there's food available and given food, we would have potentially tanked the economy and put shop owners out of business. But if we'd gone in the region where there's no food and just given cash, then that's not very helpful, because now there's no food in that region. And again, giving cash was something that came back from the survey, because here there was a lot of gangs, and they were saying, if you give us goods, it's really obvious and we may get robbed. So these are the kind of insights that sometimes you can come up with from getting sort of technical people right there, right next to the decision makers, to just kind of figure out what's going on and process data, bring a picture together. One of the other things that I got to do in Haiti was something that for me was a novel experience, which was a hand-drawn map. So obviously we have wonderful, wonderful software now to draw all of these maps, but here the head of the UN response said, here's a pen, I want you to draw the shake lines around. I am not a particularly good artist. I didn't do GCSE art at all. But here it was drawing all of this symbology, and it was an incredibly big map wall. And I got to do it with some firefighters from America who happen to be out there supporting us. And to my surprise, this became a really, really useful map for presenting stuff, orientating around the mission. And it turned out this is something that the military do quite a bit. So we had a general that came in, he absolutely loved this map. And in the end, it turned out that my artwork resulted in the general offering us a helicopter for X amount longer days, for 3 or 4 longer days than they were going to, because they could see we were doing good work and that we were on top of the picture, and it allowed us to transport more stuff. More recently, I went to Moldova, where I was supporting the Red Cross and also the UN there. And in Moldova, the picture was one of 300,000 people crossing the border and coming into Moldova. Moldova is a small country, it's a poor country in Europe. And alongside that, we were then able to see 200,000 people who moved from Moldova, most likely into Romania. So that left roughly about 100,000 people there. And of those, 5,000 people were in accommodation centers. So 95% were actually with host families, local families. So the initial response for something with refugees would be to go to accommodation centers to provide aid and support there. But here, if you did that, you'd be missing 95% of the people. So we came up with a plan alongside Red Cross to get tablets and phones to the National Red Cross Society in Moldova, and to send that society out, Red Cross, to the host families and try and find them and figure out what do they need. And to then establish how are we going to deliver aid in this situation. And it's these kind of little nuances that you figure out from just gathering data, getting information, talking, figuring out what's going on, that allow you to just change the strategy slightly to try and improve the amount of help that you're giving to individuals in the response. I was also in Poland before I was in Moldova, all because of Ukraine. And here it was really, really early days. So the UN had literally just set up their response the day before. There was about 2 people in the UN there who had arrived, and we turned up and we doubled the team, and we got there within 24 hours. Here it was slightly different from Moldova in that we were focused on what was going on within Ukraine, whereas in Moldova it was focused on what was going on in Moldova and the refugees. And that meant this was a mission purely focused on logistics. At that point, it was how do we get stuff to the border? How do we get it over the border? And how do we move it throughout Ukraine? So it was figuring out what are the railway networks, what are the road networks, how long does it take you to travel different distances? Are we able to get any information on which roads we can't travel in? And it was learning little things such as in most of Europe, we fuel trucks from underneath using a high pressure system, whereas in Ukraine, they do it from above using a low pressure system. So it was figuring out, well, what are we going to do there? Are we going to have different trucks at the border? And also realizing that most 18 to 60-year-old men in Ukraine are not going to be available to drive trucks around. And of course, it's an incredibly, incredibly difficult and complex environment for this response. One of the other things that was particularly tricky about Poland, about the Ukraine response, was that martial law had been declared. So if you remember in Haiti, I was talking about how people went out and they did these surveys and they collected information. Martial law meant surveys were illegal, and a few NGOs and charity trying to do surveys were actually arrested. So getting that picture of what was going on was incredibly difficult. And some of the stuff that we did, and we often do, if you take a look here on the left-hand side, you've got a map that WFP, World Food Programme, who coordinate logistics, have created. And they were there with post-it notes, and they're trying to track all of the grants and contracts that are going on. And we take that information, we turn it into something that's more manageable, clearer as to what's going on, and easier to update. So they can get that idea of the picture. And it's really, really common to go into the field, see maps like this now, and see people just drawing all over them. And we'll go, right, okay, let's make this into an established process. So that's an overview of some of the things that I've been able to do with MapAction and sort of what happens in the field, how we use data, and who MapAction are. These are the missions that I've been on in the last 3 years. As you can see, we end up in a lot of places, and when you're volunteering and you're giving your time, you can get some really, really fascinating experiences. So I've been fortunate to be to Mozambique because of the cyclone. I was dealing with Ebola twice in Democratic Republic of Congo. I was in Afghanistan for a national needs assessment, and here I think probably the most rewarding thing that I experienced was being able to say to a man who hadn't really seen his family for 2 months because he's running this massive national survey, trying to program in R and also learn R simultaneously. I was able to say, you go home early, I'll do this programming, I'll try and analyze this. And when he came in the next day and lots of the analysis had been done, he was really, really happy and was able to go home the next night and see his family again. So it's not just about these sort of really big scale things of impacting people. It's also about those sort of little things of how can you help the people who are doing the response there. It's in the Beirut explosion where I got a lot of interesting interaction with different generals from Lebanon who are doing a fantastic work there, and learn about how fierce the Lebanese Red Cross is. They're pretty amazing. They pretty much provide the entire ambulance service in Beirut. And then the Haiti earthquake, as I mentioned, the UK response. And here are some photos of me when I've been on missions and different stuff. There's a bit of a running joke in MapAction that I have one of the most famous backs in MapAction. And what that says about my face, I'm not entirely sure. But I do end up on a lot of promotion material and stuff like that. But you can see here, it ends up with a variety of stuff. Sometimes they ask to film you when you're on mission. And I say, hey, it's not particularly interesting because I'm just sat there on a laptop. But often also I get to interact with interesting people from different humanitarian backgrounds across the world. So thank you very much. Oh, to find out more, I'll stand because I had to give a presentation for something else, so ignore that. And that is MapAction. I'm really, really happy to hear your questions and talk about any aspects that you'd have about MapAction. In terms of becoming a volunteer, we advertise about once a year. It's something where if you have GIS experience, data analysis experience, that's what we want. But we also want strong communication skills, some life experience and stuff like that. It's an incredibly, incredibly rewarding group to be a part of. And then the other side of things is, of course, we're always looking for donations. Money is incredibly, incredibly helpful. And we're a very lean organization. So any donations that are given are really, really effective in terms of actually be used for humanitarian response and for the things that we're trying to do. So thank you very much, and happy to hear about any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That was absolutely fascinating talk. I was enthralled all the way through. Brilliant. I can see that there's some question, well, one question's come up in the chat already. Do you want me to read them out, or would you rather read them out yourself?
It's okay, I'm happy to do them. Yeah,
Okay.
so first one I can see is, how do you cope with restricted bandwidth in the area of operations? So there's a device called a BGAN, which is a broadband global area network. And that is something that you basically face at satellites and you can get satellite internet. We have one of those ourselves. We will deploy into the field with it if necessary, and we will use it, but it's incredibly expensive. So to give an example, during Haiti 2010, the military, US military, turned up with these BGANs, and they ended up running up a bill of like millions and millions of dollars for the internet. It's something like $5 a megabyte or something like that. So we, as a small charity, try to avoid using it if we can. There are some other organizations. So you're probably familiar with Doctors Without Borders, and it feels to me every time I turn up on a mission, I discover another X without borders. So there's one called Télécoms Sans Frontières, so telecoms without borders, and what they will do is turn up and they will set up internet, and can be in a variety of ways. I've seen them like cut into cables and that are like just in the streets and just connect it to somewhere, and suddenly they're just taking internet from something. They also turn up with their own stuff to create things. They might turn up with sort of dongles and things like that. But the other side of us is we turn up with cables to connect all of our computers. And if there is no internet, the data scramble is downloaded and put onto the laptop, and we will just start mapping using that. It's now the case that for there not to be internet, it would be incredibly, incredibly serious. And I would expect there to be internet after sort of 3 days, 4 days. But the other side is, I may ask people in the UK to support us. Say there's stuff with rasters or things like that. They'll do the processing. They might even create the map, and then I'm just receiving a PDF if that's what's needed. Then next question is, how do you raise funds to operate? So we do a whole bunch of stuff. If there is a mission, we'll put on our website to say, here are the missions that we're responding to. And that will be more aimed at individuals to try and get sort of smaller donations and stuff like that. We also go and get grants through different agencies. So we try with the UK government. That's been a bit more difficult more recently with funding, but we are funded by USAID and by some German government and stuff like that. And that's where we'll say, hey, we want grants to do this stuff. And there's sort of a difference between restricted funding and unrestricted. Unrestricted funding for charities is the best thing in the world because you can spend it on whatever you want, yeah, which means you can fill in all your needs. Restricted funding is when a charity, when an organization goes, you can have this money for this, and sometimes that means it's not very flexible in what you can spend it on. So say we only did 3 missions in a year, and they gave us lots and lots of money, and we're going, oh, we could really use this to strengthen how we respond, and there's no more missions because fortunately there hasn't been disasters. That can be really difficult. And then the other things we have is people run the London Marathon each year and that kind of stuff as well. Okay, are there equivalent organizations in other European countries? So a little bit. There are, in terms of the humanitarian field, what this comes under is it's called information management. And now there are some other groups that will have information management rosters or volunteers that are sort of part of their organizations. But in terms of how MapAction is, very, very few, yeah, if any. And really, in terms of it being sort of so geospatially and data focused, not really. There are some bigger charities. So there's one called ACAPS that focus on assessments and things like that, but focused purely on, like, more so on the spatial, not really. And also not really so much in America or stuff like that. The UN will have their own information management, but information management ranges from creating a spreadsheet, which is like a list of names and, say, email addresses, through to doing surveys. And clearly the first skill doesn't require as much, say, technical knowledge as like the second one. And we'll go in and we'll support them. Compared to what it was like in 2002, when we would turn up to the field and there'd be no one, there's been a lot of progress, but there's still not really anyone that does it quite in the same way that we do. We have a bit of a reputation. So a sort of funny story, I was in Hungary on my way over to Moldova, and this guy from the Red Cross was saying that he really likes MapAction because you turn up, there's been an emergency, and you'll hike through the jungle for days, you turn up, and there they are sat on their laptops, like printing stuff out saying, where have you been? So we have a real reputation for getting there incredibly quickly and then being not jolly, but like in good spirits and just kind of doing whatever's necessary. So next question is, how many of the team do you normally deploy at a time? So we have an aim always to send a 3-person team. That's the kind of gold for us, because that means you can have a team lead, and the team lead will end up in a lot of meetings and probably not do much mapping. Then you've got 2 people that can crack on with the data analysis, the mapping and stuff like that. Most typically, we end up with a 2-person team, and sometimes a 1-person team. If it's a 1-person team, it would be, say, someone like myself that's experienced and been on missions. And then what we'll do, if we can, is try and have remote support. So COVID led to us developing a hybrid model, because we were doing a bunch of remote missions, and Beirut was actually our first remote mission. So you remember how I said we deploy within 24 hours? With Beirut, it was even quicker, because we had people sat in the UK, switched on their laptops, started mapping as soon as it came out. And then I was able to get together, fly over to Beirut, and then I was liaising with the team back in the UK, and they provided support throughout the mission. So it's become a bit more variable, but we aim for 3, predominantly we get 2. How can MapAction volunteers afford to go on missions? How are people's regular workplaces able to spare them? Okay, so variable. What happens for some people is you speak to an employer, they may say, okay, if you go on a 2-week mission a year, I'll let you do that. But 1 week is going to be annual leave for you, and I will give you an extra week for the mission that will be paid. So that's how some people do it. Some individuals will take their entire annual leave. I don't think that's the best way of doing it, because you need to rest at some point. And then others have stuff set up where they might write a blog post or something when they come back, or they'll do a presentation or something like that. I would say, fortunately, MapAction is very good at speaking to employers to say, look, we're spending about £10,000 to £15,000 a year training your employee. They're going to gain experience that they probably won't be able to get at your company, and therefore they're going to be a far more valuable employee. And then the other side, I would say, is you make yourself incredibly reliable at work. So if you're able to be somebody that goes, hey, I always deliver at work, I do these things, then when you turn around to your boss and you say, hey, here's this extra kind of like leniency, I would like to be able to do this stuff, you kind of let them put 2 and 2 together, that they wouldn't want you to leave or go somewhere else that's a bit more willing to let you do stuff. And they go, okay, do you know what? 2 weeks away once a year is probably not too much of a burden on my job. So it's variable. And fortunately, for that, but also unfortunately, sometimes for MapAction is typically we want really good people. Really good people get promoted, they become more senior, they get more responsibilities. So sometimes it can be a real challenge for volunteers to have time to do stuff. Oh, okay. Can additional people support a mission from back home? So yes, they can. And this is something where that hybrid model is becoming better. But typically what we found is we're not quite at the situation where we go, hey, we want many people working on this, because we're not set up as a charity quite in that structure for our responses. What we do is train people really well, and then give them a lot of sort of responsibility and autonomy to do stuff, rather than having sort of narrowly defined stuff that, say, OpenStreetMap has. So it's a bit more challenging for us to go, there's a mission now, let's pull in 30 new people and try and get help. Because you'd have a really steep learning curve of being in our processes and stuff like that. This is something that we're looking at, and we're trying to expand and get to a point where we can try and get more support. But in terms of the volunteering, it's becoming sort of more and more desired and acceptable for us to be able to go, can we have people who maybe are going to deploy remotely and stuff like that, and increase the amount of people that we have available, and maybe, you know, years down the line that their life circumstance will change, or they'll gain more confidence, or they'll decide, oh, I would like to go into the field, and great. But there would be no sort of requirement for them to be doing that. And we kind of go through these sort of peaks and troughs of having people who are remote deployers and do something called support base, and people that go into the field. So yes, but not in terms of us going, hey, we need help, who's available? We often get people emailing saying, hey, I have some GIS skills, which is really nice. And obviously there's that strong desire. I think one of the things I often reflect on this is everybody wants to help when there is an emergency. But then when that sort of the hype and everything sort of quietens, very, very few people are there going, right, thinking about, well, how will I help when the next one comes along? And that's where I think MapAction is absolutely fantastic, because it allows people like myself to go, when there is an emergency, I have a mechanism that I know will be able to get me into the field and support. Okay, who started MapAction? Okay, so I can't remember the person's name, but Rupert Douglas Bates, I believe, and his son. And they started this charity, and it was called Aid for Aid. And the idea was the people that were providing aid needed support and help to make decisions. And then shortly after, there were other people that came into the organization to sort of build it up. And they very, very quickly decided that Aid for Aid was not a great name, and changed it to MapAction, and that would have been around 2002. And the first CEO was a guy called David Spackman, and he came from a military background, and basically with like a couple of sticks to rub together, he then kind of got a whole bunch of people together, a small team, and they would start, initially the training would be like to 2 a.m. on a Saturday, and then sort of maybe going all throughout the night preparing for all this stuff. And then there was a typhoon in the Philippines, I believe in 2002, and that was a case of just putting some people on a plane, getting them out there and showing them they can be useful. Because at that point, it was very much, no one had any idea what GIS was. No one knew that data and analysis and things like that could be helpful in this situation. We got out there, showed we were useful, and then they went, great, come back again. And it's been, what, 20 years since then, and we keep getting invited, which is an absolute privilege. It's incredibly, honestly, amazing to turn up when you see stuff like this on the TV, and then 24 hours later, you're there going, I think I might be able to do something that's helpful. You can't always be helpful. You know, I've had times where, yeah, I end up sort of not making it worse, but just going, oh, I can't seem to be able to talk to anyone or get the data we need or that kind of stuff. And it can be incredibly frustrating. But the majority of the time, I find there's a way through, and we do a lot of sort of harmonizing between different groups. We're really, really unassuming, which is incredibly helpful. We don't really have an agenda. So I'll happily talk to the UN, the Red Cross, the government, whoever. And sometimes we can get those different organizations to start talking with each other just because we don't seem very threatening or anything like that. And suddenly they're sharing data or stuff like that. So yeah, very happy. If there's any other questions, please put them in the chat. What do you need most? Okay. Funding, I would say. Yeah, like in life, unfortunately, everything comes down to money, doesn't it? Yeah, if somebody turned around and went, here's several million, we typically have we cost about £1 million a year. We would like to increase that, and we want to expand over the next years, going up to sort of 2, 3, 4 million a year. So if somebody turned up and offered us 5 million, we would turn MapAction into a much, much bigger thing. So Chris Barrington, if you are very, very rich, feel free. Deployable volunteers, we have some really good ones. We are taking them in every year, so they are really, really necessary. Supporting the volunteers, that's where funding would allow us to do that. Equipment, we have pretty good kit, but yeah, and laptops, stuff like that can be really, really useful. Again, comes back to the funding. Training, yeah, definitely, probably not the thing we need most. We do a lot of training, we're pretty good at it. But yeah, funding pretty much, particularly as we try and embark on this expansion. How long do people stay as volunteers with MapAction? We do a 10-year service award, and every year at Christmas, we give out the 10-year award. There's always somebody receiving that award, if not multiple people every year. Yeah, so there are people, I think there's someone that's been there maybe 19 years, something like that. There's probably someone that's been there since 2002, coming up to 20. So there are people that stay there a long time. I've been there 6 years. To be honest, it doesn't even feel like I've been there 6 years. But at the same time, we have some people, they come and they go, do you know what? I didn't realize how much of a commitment it was, or my life circumstances changed, and they maybe leave within the first year. Yeah, but after you sort of get past that point, a lot of people are staying with MapAction for quite some time. Cool. Barbara, I can see you've got your hand up.
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Could I just declare an interest for other people watching and listening? I'm both a past president of BCS, but more importantly, I need to declare an interest as a past trustee of MapAction. And I'm absolutely delighted that Chris has given this talk. I commend MapAction to BCS as worthwhile at all kinds of levels, and Chris has highlighted some of those. Yes, we need funding. Yes, we need volunteers. It is one of the most worthwhile organizations, I have to say, that I've ever been associated with. It's an amazing team of people. We have geographers, cartographers, software developers, all kinds of volunteers. And every single one of them has fought very hard to become a volunteer, I have to say. One thing that Chris has not highlighted is that in that annual recruitment drive, they are subjected to a quite intensive question and answer discussion sessions where people like me are peering in at them and assessing them. And it really is quite tough. It's a very tough recruitment because we desperately need people who are like Chris, who have the wherewithal to go out into these disaster areas and really serve the communities that they're there to serve. And I really do commend Chris and the whole of MapAction to the society. It is a worthwhile activity to become involved in, either in funding or in volunteering, any which way. And one thing I would finish on is if you work in an organization, I mean, many of you will know that I have worked in both Military Survey and the UK Hydrographic Office. And both those organisations have invited MapAction in to give presentations to their staff. And that's been a very worthwhile thing. So if any of you work for organisations where you think there will be interest, do invite them in, because people will come along and give similar lectures that Chris has just given. That's it. Thanks, Chris. That was great.
Yeah,
Cool.
thanks, Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Chris. There you go. Praise indeed from Barbara, and a long-standing member of BCS as well. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much for your time this evening. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there, because otherwise I may well have to get out of the room that I'm currently in, and I'll have to disappear. So thank you ever so much for your time. Really interesting talk tonight. And as you can see from the comments in there and the people who are still here, everyone really enjoyed it. Thanks again. just to wrap up then, so looking forward to the next Teatime talk next month. We have Mark Horowitz from Sky-Fi. So keep an eye on your emails, keep an eye on the BCS website. If anyone didn't see the links that I posted in there for MapAction, there is a link on the BCS website. So please do have a look at it and have a look at the website and see how you might be able to help, whether that be getting involved yourself or actually donating some of your hard-earned cash to that cause. So thanks very much, Chris, and good night.